Anugrahaniya Shila
Atmanugrahaniya Shila
Ragyam Kulam Brahmana Bhasoja
Ragyam Kulam Brahmana Bhasoja
Durat Vishishtam Vatakarya Karma
Durashishtam Vatakarya Karma.
O Raja Uvacha, the fortunate king said, Vayam, we, Dunyatama, most thankful, Nirpanam, of all the kings, Mahatma, of the great souls, Anugrahaniya Sila, trained to get favors, Ragyam, of the royal, Kulam, orders, Brahmana Pada, feet of the Brahmanas, Sochat, refuse after cleaning, Durat, at a distance, Visishtam, always left out, Bata, on account of, Garhya, condemnable, Karma, activities. Translation: the fortunate king said, indeed, we are the most grateful of all the kings who were trained to get favors from the great souls. Generally, you sages consider royalty as refuse to be rejected and left in a distant place. Purport: according to religious principles, stool, urine, wash water, etc. must be left at a long distance. Attached bathrooms and urinals, etc. may be very convenient amenities of modern civilization, but they are ordered to be situated at a distance from residential quarters. That very example is cited herein in relation to the kingly order for those who are progressively marching back to Godhead. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said that to be in intimate touch with dollars and cents men or the kingly order is worse than suicide for one who desires to go back to Godhead. In other words, the transcendentalists do not generally associate with men who are too enamored by the external beauty of God's creation. By advanced knowledge and spiritual realization, the transcendentalist knows that this beautiful material world is nothing but a shadowy reflection of the reality, the kingdom of God. They are not, therefore, very much captivated by royal opulence or anything like that. But in case of Maharaj Parikshit, the situation was different. Apparently, the king was condemned to death by an inexperienced Brahmana boy, but factually he was called by the Lord to return to him. Other transcendentalists, the great sages and mystics who assembled together because of Maharaj Parikshit's fasting unto death, were quite anxious to see him, for he was going back to Godhead. Maharaj Parikshit also could understand that the great sages who assembled there were all kind to his forefathers, the Pandavas, because of their devotional service to the Lord. He therefore felt grateful to the sages for being present there at the last stage of his life, and he felt that it was all due to the greatness of his late forefathers or grandfathers. He felt proud, therefore, that he happened to be the descendants of such great devotees. Such pride for the devotees of the Lord is certainly not equal to the puffed up sense of vanity for material prosperity. The first is reality, whereas the other is false and vain. Translation: the fortunate king said, indeed, we are the most grateful of all the kings who are trained to get favors from the great souls. Generally, you sages consider royalty as refuse to be rejected and left in a distant place. As Prabhupada points out in the purport in this first sentence, that certain items are considered to be rejectable because they're unclean, and therefore we don't like to touch them in any way, and we stay far away from those things. So he says that the toilets are not supposed to be in the building, they're supposed to be far away. So that's just an example of unclean things. We don't want to touch them. So of course there's physical contamination due to objects, which is natural because we do know that sanitation is very good for your health, and if you don't have sanitary habits, then you get sick. So from a physical point of view, it's very practical to do such things. Keep the contaminated products away from the living place. So that's one type of idea of socha, or cleanliness. And therefore we have to, if we contact these items, then we have methods of becoming clean, some of which are ritualistic and some of which are practical. So of course the practical aspect is you bathe and wash and scrub to get rid of all the contamination. The more ritualistic aspect, or we can say spiritual aspect, is that we're not only concerned about the physical aspect, we're also concerned about the spiritual aspect, or how the physical can affect the spiritual. For instance, if we have uncleanliness and tamagun, it's not good for spiritual life. So the fact that something is tamasic and unclean is not good for our spiritual development, apart from the physical aspect. So mentally and spiritually it's not good also. So therefore there is an attempt not only to purify in the grossest way, that is physically speaking, but on a more subtle level. And that's why we also use mantras. So when you bathe, you're supposed to chant mantras to remember the Supreme Lord. So that's a way of, say, spiritualizing the whole process of cleanliness. So, that is one level. Then we have the other type of uncleanliness. That is not the physical aspect. I'll say a little more subtle. And that is that apart from, materially contaminating substances, we have things, objects, which by their nature may also be contaminating. So in the Varnashram system, outcasts and persons like that are considered unclean, and therefore the Brahmana cannot go near those people. So let's say Varna contamination. So you keep the Varnas separate. The Brahmanas are separate from the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas and the Sudras. Even recently, let's say 500 years ago or so, when the Europeans came to India, they noticed that they had these peculiar habits, or rituals, or whatever, customs, or laws also. And that was the respect for the Brahmana. So if the Brahmana walked down the street, the other people had to hide. No one could be in sight of the Brahmana, because it was contaminating for the Brahmana to see the lower castes. And particularly the Sudras or less, they couldn't show their face at all. It's like, so the Brahmana walked down the street, everybody went, there's nobody on the street. That was 500 years ago. Yeah. And so in other words, there was, attachment to this idea of purity, not only by physical aspects, but by caste, etc. And we see that carried over here, where the kings are not considered very pure by the Brahmanas, the sages. They don't want to associate with the kingly order because kings deal with, money and materialistic things. So that's contaminating. So we should not come near those persons. We see even that was strictly followed by Lord Chaitanya. He did not want to meet King Prataparudra, even though he was a great devotee, because I was just a king, a sannyasi, I should not go near such a person. Of course, the others could, but especially for the sannyasi, that was considered prohibited, to get near the people of, materialistic nature. So there's all these different rules about what is not considered to be pure, and therefore we have to avoid those things. So it's not just the physical aspect and the, let's say, getting sick from germs, etc., but it's the more subtle aspect of getting influenced materially, getting material influence of another person. So the persons below the Brahmins are mixed with the lower gunas, rajas and tamas. So therefore, if you mix with them, you'll get contaminated and your sattva will disappear. So therefore, the Brahmins should stay separate from the others. So similar to the sages here, in general, they stay separate from the kingly order. But we have exceptions to that rule. We have great kings who, though they are involved with ruling the material world and involved with money and other things, they are also highly elevated. So sometimes these are called the Rajarshis, the kings who are also sages. They're saintly kings. Or we can say also devotee kings. So they are, because of their spiritual practice, they are not contaminated by the gunas. In fact, any devotee of the Lord is beyond the gunas. So therefore, the rule should not apply to them. Now, those who are lesser in intelligence, even among the Brahminical community, may not understand this principle, like the exceptional case. But those who are of more elevated nature and appreciate devotion and spiritual life, they can understand this, and therefore they will associate with the king who is also a devotee of the Lord. And that is what has happened here. All the great sages we see, not just ordinary sages, but the greatest sages actually happened to come here. And they were not ordered to come. They came by their free will to give blessings and counsel to the king. So, in other words, this king, Parikshit, was very, very special. He was not an normal king. He was a devotee king. And these sages also understood that he was not contaminated by material nature, so that there was no need to stay away from him. But anyway, in this verse, Parikshit Maharaj is admitting that, well, generally the sages don't come to visit the royalty because they're like garbage. Royalty is like garbage, and one will stay away from the garbage, so the great sages will stay away from the garbage of the kings. But in this case, they're coming, so this is very, very great mercy. And therefore, he says he is most fortunate. Donyatama. We're the most fortunate of all because we get the blessings from these Brahmanas who usually don't associate with kings at all. So, in this way, he praises these kings and also admits his humble position in front of those great souls. So, as I mentioned, we have these two levels: the conventional level, which is practical, so we don't get contaminated. We have to avoid certain things. And then we have the exceptional case. So this is an example of how we have rules and we have exceptions to rules, and we have to sometimes understand that there are exceptions to rules, and we can't get too fanatical. And therefore we have to have that little bit of wisdom to understand the exceptional cases too, and then permit those particular cases. So we have to have a broader knowledge and also a more elevated consciousness to be able to understand the principles at work. So for that reason, Dharma itself is a little difficult to implement properly. We can't just use a few rules of Dharma and start forcing everybody to follow those rules. They're general rules, and then there's exceptions to the rules, and there's exceptions to the exceptions, etc. So it's a little bit more complex than we think. And that is why we need a proper king to institute those rules, because he will be aware of the general cases and the exceptional cases, and he can apply the rules properly with proper insight. So therefore the ruler actually has to be highly qualified, not just in knowing the rules, but how to apply them. And the way he applies them is by having this higher perspective on things, having a higher realization or higher consciousness by which he can implement in a very practical way, in a very just way. So therefore the king is not just a material position, it requires some spiritual input also. And thus, even in this varnashram system, which is basically material to handle the material aspects of life, the king cannot be simply Rajagun. The Rajagun instinct will give him control over everybody, Ishvara Bhav. We like to control. That is a sign of Kshatriya nature, yeah? But if that is by itself, it is rather useless, and it will cause destruction. So though that is there, the king also has a mixture of sattva gun. He is not pure rajagun. He has a balance of sattva gun. And that sattva gun, of course, sattva means knowledge and detachment. That is what sattva is. So knowledge means he's aware that he's not his body. So therefore that Ishvara Bhav is one nature of the king. I like to control everybody. At the same time, because he's sattvic, he understands I'm not the material body. So his sense of controlling everybody is there, balanced by the fact that actually he's not the body. So he doesn't get overtaken by that concept of I have to control everybody, and that's the goal of life. So there's a balance there between the sattva and the rajas. And because of the sattva in the king, he gives respect to the brahmanas. As we see here, Parikshit gives respect to all these great sages. Now, if he is only, the king is only in the mode of passion, he will not be too interested in the sattvic people. We say, what do they contribute to us? They're just, doing nothing, useless people, floating around just giving advice. What are they? They're not practical, they're not making profit, they're not doing anything. So, but the king, who is a proper king because he has the sattva, he understands and respects the nature of the brahmana. And the nature of the brahmana, of course, is more detachment, more understanding is not the body, and reliance on scriptures. So therefore the king will depend on the brahmanas for getting advice, spiritual advice particularly, but advice in all affairs that are related to, that are mentioned in scriptures. So here Parikshit is welcoming these great sages because he can get spiritual knowledge from them. If he had no sattva or no devotion, then he would not do that. But because he has a mixture of sattva in him, then he will naturally give respect to the sages. Higher than that, of course, is that Parikshit is also a devotee of the Lord, so that's even more important, of course. If you have sattva, good, but sattva also is material, so the king also should have devotion to the Lord, recognition of the Lord, and Parikshit had great devotion to the Lord. He's a pure devotee of the Lord, a very exalted devotee of the Lord. So that's even a higher qualification. So therefore he will not only respect all the Brahmins and sages, but he will particularly be interested in those who present bhakti. Those are the most important of all. So many sages, but those who are the great devotees, those who are propagating devotional service, they're the best of all those persons there. He'll give the highest respect to those persons. We'll see that among the sages, finally we get Sukadev Goswami. Other people were there and they presented different things, what to do when you're dying, So they can talk about karma kanda or whatever. There were many sages like Vasishta and Atri and all these other sons of Brahma were there, and they were basically karma kandis and karma yoga type persons, So they can recommend that. It's okay. At least it's within the Vedic purview or whatever, with those largely Rajagun. The Gyanis were there. The great Gyanis interested in liberation were also there, and the yogis were there. And they can recommend a liberation, get out of the material world, renounce everything and get moksha, whatever like that. In spite of that, they're all great sages in giving these recommendations. Parikshit Maharaj was not so impressed with that. But when Sukadev Goswami came, and then he said, well, what are you supposed to do? Well, you hear about the Lord and chant about the Lord. You glorify the Lord and you hear the topics of the Lord. That is the ultimate. So that is bhakti, devotional service. So then, Parikshit Maharaj listened to him. This is his choice of all the different sages and their advice. He chose to take the words of Sukadev Goswami, great devotee of the Lord. So that shows, of course, the king's qualification, that he was more interested in bhakti than all these other processes, because he was a great devotee. So he was a great king, but more important for us, Parikshit Maharaj was a great devotee of the Lord. So because he is a great devotee, he will also display the characteristics of the lower level, that is conduct of a king, an ideal king. So whatever a normal king will do, then Parikshit will also do. But of course he is this higher aspect because he's a devotee of the Lord, and then when Sukadev Goswami comes, and he's willing to listen to him. Other kings may just accept the karmakanda aspect or the liberation aspect of the sages. They won't be so impressed with Sukadev Goswami's advice. And they will also receive the great sages and welcome them as Parikshit Maharaj does, but ultimately they won't have the same attraction to the message of Sukadev Goswami. So Parikshit's in a special position, and these characteristics of being a great king and respecting sages is fine, but ultimately greater than that is his aspect as a devotee of the Lord. And that, therefore, all of this whole section, the whole second part of the first canto is dedicated to coming to this position of showing how King Parikshit accepted the teachings of Sukadev Goswami, ultimately. So more than being a king, he was devotee of the Lord. That's his great aspect. So though devotion is the highest, a devotion does not restrict a person. Some processes, if you go to a higher process, you give up the lower process. If you become a jnani, you give up the karma. If you have to do karma, you give up sinful activities below that. If you're non-varnashram, you give up that and participate in the varnashram. When you're doing varnashram, then you become a jnani and you start giving up your karma. The devotee of the Lord, however, he doesn't have to give up anything. He can continue. So Parikshit was a great devotee, but he was a great king at the same time. And he did not give up his duty. The same, of course, was his ancestors, the Pandavas. Parikshit Maharaj tolerated everything and became the king of the world, and etc., up until the point when Krishna disappeared. So he maintained that position, even though he was a great devotee of the Lord. He didn't reject his duties or whatever. So the devotees of the Lord can exist within this world and carry out their duties in the world, and at the same time they can be great devotees. It's not a problem for them. So that was emphasized by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He said that anybody can take to devotional service and chant the holy name. It doesn't matter whether they're renounced or householders or whatever. Anybody can take part in the process, and they can all advance. So he didn't emphasize the varna or ashram, but rather simply the power of the process of bhakti. And you can participate in the varna ashram system, whatever, at the same time, and carry out your devotional service. And that is the example we'll see of Pariksha Maharaj and the Pandavas, and in the past we'll find in the Bhagavatam the great kings like Dhruva and others. Kings, at the same time, great devotees of the Lord. So the process of bhakti is not hindered by the activities that a person may carry out in this world, as long as they are not contrary to the principles of bhakti. So basically the rules of varnashram are there, and they're not contrary to bhakti, so the kings and others, they follow these rules and they go on with their devotional service simultaneously. So that's how they carry out their success. So Lord Chaitanya emphasized this principle, and later on, again, Bhaktivinoda Thakur also in his writings, he emphasizes this, that we don't try to artificially renounce everything in favor of bhakti. Rather, the renunciation is a gradual process. So bhakti itself creates the detachment, and if the detachment is enough finally, then you can physically renounce everything and give up all the other activities and just do the bhakti. Otherwise, you continue your duties as a grihastha or in the varnashram system or whatever, and at the same time do your devotional service. So he said this is the natural way of creating detachment, by going through the process of bhakti and at the same time doing all your duties in life, and then gradually as you advance in bhakti, you become more and more detached. So we call it sahaj vairagya, natural vairagya. So if one performs bhakti properly, then one should progress. Progress in bhakti means more attachment to the Supreme Lord, more surrender to the Supreme Lord. More surrender to the Supreme Lord means more detachment from everything else. So naturally one becomes detached. So the two things go together, progress in bhakti and detachment from everything in the material world. So it's a secondary aspect that results from the attachment to the Supreme Lord. Of course, the counter-argument is enjoyment of the material world is a problem for bhakti. So if we're too attached, then we cannot advance. So that is also true. And therefore we have the 10th offense to the holy name, to be too materially attached, even after understanding all the glories of the holy name. So if we're too attached, then it is very difficult to advance. So qualification for bhakti is not too much material attachment. That's the qualification to start bhakti. So if we have that level of not too attached, we're not completely detached, but we're not too attached. Then we can start the process, and gradually we get less and less attachment to material energy, more and more attachment to Krishna. But if we have too much attachment in the beginning and very little attachment to the Lord, very, very difficult to practice at all, and therefore that progress won't take place naturally. So therefore the qualification is not too much attachment, but in the middle, so to speak. So this is a practical way in which we can advance in devotional service. So that is why the process of bhakti is also recommended for everybody, because it's more practical than the other processes which require greater qualification. If you're to do jnana and yoga, you have to be fixed in sattva already and remarkably detached to start. It's very, very difficult if you're not. So therefore you have to be a brahmana to be a jnani, because brahmanas are detached and brahmanas are fixed in sattva. Same with yoga. So in this way, the only option is to do karma yoga if you're not going to do devotion. But then even karma yoga has requirements. If you're not up to the level of a Sudra, then you're outside, you cannot participate. So you have to have a certain level of being on the Sudra level. So you have to agree to that, then you participate in the system. And of course, then you do need the king. And if you don't have the king, then it doesn't work. So that is why in Kali Yuga generally that whole varnashram system does not operate too well because of absence of kings. All we can do is take those rules and apply them as much as we can and hope for the best, but the whole system is not intact, so it's very difficult to follow properly. So in this way we can try to advance in devotional service, and this is unimpeded by all the problems around us and whatever. It operates independently of everything else, and we can do it in any situation. So therefore it's the recommended process for us. Okay, any questions? Prabhupada here mentions about pride. Parikshit Maharaj had some pride, not the normal material pride where we have pride in our material possessions, but his pride was that he belonged to a great devotional family. So there's nothing wrong with that. To have a good background of devotion in terms of forefathers and the Pandavas, etc., that he was in that line. Obviously to recognize great devotees of the Lord, very, very good. So that in that sense. But we should not think that the pride of Parikshit was a type of false pride where because I was born in that family, therefore I'm great. It doesn't mean that. Which is what we've criticized people for when they say, I'm born in this family, therefore I'm a great person, or I'm born in a Brahmin family, therefore you have to respect me as a Brahmana. So, not in that sense. But he gave respect to his devotional ancestry, understanding his great nature, and he felt very fortunate to be in that line. So his pride is not the same as material pride, it's more like recognizing his good fortune. And paying respects to those great devotees.
Hare Krishna, isn't it contrary when we say, okay, you do still your work and be a great devotee, and then Rupa Goswami says, Yana Karmana Adhyanapratam, pure devotion service is free from yam and karma.
Okay, so what that means is Jnana Karma Adhyanapratam, it's not covered by or obstructed by the Jnana and Karma. So it can be obstructed by Jnana if we practice Jnana with the intent of merging in Brahman, then that's very contrary to Bhakti. So that type of Jnana we don't want. But to get knowledge of Krishna or Bhagavad Jnana, that's very good. So that doesn't obstruct our thing. So that type of knowledge is good. The knowledge which is unfavorable, that is impersonal Jnana, that we have to reject. The same with karma. Karma in itself, if it helps regulate us, then very good. But where it helps us develop nurture our material desire and our desire to go to Svargaloka or something like that, then it's bad. So in other words, the karma kanda aspect of karma yoga, where you're aspiring to go to Svargaloka and enjoy there, that's contaminating to bhakti, so that's rejected. If you do some of the karmas or duties of the varnashram system, which are not specifically aimed at sense enjoyment, but simply controlling your senses and whatever, good. It's good for us. Okay? So we don't reject those rules. So the varnashram system does have rules for cleanliness, as here, like the rules. You keep the waste products out of the house, and if you get contaminated, you have to take a bath. So that we follow. Try to be pure physically. So there are physical rules from the varnashram system. We follow those. There are social rules that we follow in terms of raising families, samskars for the children, marriage ceremony, etc. We follow those rules. We were just taking them from the varnashram system. It's not that we'd suddenly invent a new system of marriage for the devotees or whatever. We're taking that system from the varnashram system and the Vedic rituals, etc. So all those activities are also taken over from the varnashram system. And well, of course, if they worship Devatas and those things, then we try to change it so it's worship of Supreme Lord. So then it's non-contrary to bhakti. Then we can do those things like that. So in terms of social life, family life, physical cleanliness, brushing your teeth, bathing, all that, clothing, okay, we take from the Varnashram system. It's favorable to bhakti. Other things, such as worship of devatas, aiming for Svargaloka, that we have to reject. That part of karma. So when it obstructs the bhakti, then we reject it. In other words, it interferes with anya abhidashita shunya, and devoid of other desires. When we start, those activities start producing other desires in us, a desire for liberation or desire for material enjoyment, then that becomes wrong. So then we can't do that. So Jnana and karma are not rejected outright, but where they contaminate the bhakti with other desires, then that's wrong.
So, Maharishi, we're explaining some aspects of Varnashram, in terms of the way the Brahmanas would interact with the lower castes. But that seems to be quite contrary to Parik's stance here, because he's not considering himself proud because of his family and things like that. And then if we look at Srila Prabhupada, he describes historically there was an era where someone who was one of the lower lines, when they walk down the street, they had to say, I'm just walking down the street, go inside, close your doors. And Prabhupada says that was actually, that kind of mentality was a downfall. That's how.
That's why there was opposition. So we get all these other movements, not just Islam, even Buddhism, I say, came up because of too much casteism and social discontent of the lower castes, etc. Or Jainism also, they say, rose up because of that.
And they felt pushed down by the Brahmanas, therefore they rejected the system. So it seems like that concept or that notion of Varnashram is actually detrimental.
Of course there is, that sense of, okay, the Brahmanas are pure, they get more respect, etc. So that's automatically there in the system. When it's carried to extremes, of course, that's when we get the rebellion against it. When they become exclusive and extreme, and they get great hostility. So that also took place even in India, even after the independence. So they began to, criticize the Brahmanas for being too, getting all the privileges and stuff, and then take away, don't give them any jobs, don't do this, and, give all the privileges to the outcasts and people like that. So they, and Brahmanas ended up suffering because of that.
So historically, are there any examples of like a functional Varnashram system without the influence of bhakti? Or is it only when there's the
Oh, well, Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls it Asuric Varnashram. Asuric Varnashram. So around the world, we'll find remnants of the Varnashram. You'll have intellectuals and Vaishyas and managers and whatever, and Sudras. You'll find the groups, they don't call them that, and then they're not so strictly segregated or whatever, but we have those natural classes there. But where that system hasn't got an idea of leading you to purification so that eventually you can take to bhakti, then it's considered to be useless.
But what I mean is like in the Varnashram system, one's actually seeing the system holistically. They see the role of everyone within the system. It's just like with your body, you don't discriminate against all the legs, you just So if someone's seeing the Varnashram system holistically, they can see the role of every personality.
So the king should be like that. He should.
So without bhakti, does that happen?
It's very difficult, because the king will tend to exploit. And then we get, same thing. The leader starts to exploit everybody because he doesn't have that detachment or even sattva, what to speak of devotion, so they're very difficult for them to implement anything, They can talk about it, but they'll eventually get overcome by those temptations.
So essentially without bhakti, we can say the Varnashram is useless.
Yeah. Well, that's why in Bhagavatam, the Talmud says that, the whole goal of Varnashram is to satisfy the Lord. But for the people in general, it may be a little indirect. But at least the king has to understand that. So therefore the kings come from Manu. And they're all empowered by the Lord, and they do have devotion. And Duryodhana would not be accepted as the king, or could not be accepted as king, because he rejected the Lord completely. He ignored Krishna, said Krishna is not God. So he was
So as long as the leader
rejected.
has the perspective of seeing the
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
sort of structure of our Varnashram will work.
Yeah.
That's why the Varnashram, that's why the importance of the Vaishnava. Because Varnashram is a perfected system if one follows the prescriptions given by the Varna and the Ashram.
Yeah.
But the tendency, because there will be an effect of the modes of material nature.
Yeah.
And so therefore there will be exploitation. And it's almost expected in the material world. So, although the Vaishnava, one who is actually a Vaishnava, it's not strictly part of the Varnashram system.
It's transcendental.
It's a great necessity for the Vaishnava to be always teaching and instructing and giving that input to maintain the sanctity of the Varnashram, to maintain the goal of the Varnashram.
Yeah, otherwise everyone will exploit everybody else.
Yeah.
Ultimately, yeah. Of course, you can try to enforce the ruler's orders. You can't do that. You keep out of control, but it doesn't last too long. Everybody gets frustrated and they say, we don't like to follow these orders. We want to get our enjoyment.
Excuse me, Maharaj. So there's been a lot of conversation going on. It's been going on for some time within our society, within ISKCON, about implementation of Varnashram. And then someone rang me a day or so ago, a little alarmed that there seems to be more of a push towards Varnashram implementation. And she was particularly concerned about what the role of women would be in that. Could you speak a little bit to that? You're on the GBC.
Well, we're actually discussing that on the GBC because obviously a lot of devotees say, well, Prabhupada said, half my work is done and Varnashram is the other part of it, half which I didn't implement, so what are we going to do about it? So we have to do it in some sense because Prabhupada puts some emphasis, actually more emphasis, Prabhupada puts more emphasis on it than even the scriptures themselves, like Bhagavatam. Bhagavatam generally kind of emphasizes the bhakti more, but Prabhupada says, half my work is Varnashram, so then what are we going to do about it, So he does put that emphasis, but nevertheless, up until this point, it's been a little bit of a rather haphazard type attempt of different devotees to do something, and we also don't really know what did Prabhupada mean by that. What does he mean by that Varnashram that he wanted to implement? We don't know. He didn't make the details of that and how to apply it to the devotees. So there's a problem there with what is that Varnashram that Prabhupada meant. Obviously it cannot be the same as the other Varnashram, not practical in this world. So what is it? So we have to discuss about that. So that's one of the topics of the GBC we're discussing next week. We have second discussion we're having on this. The general, I don't know if it's confidential or whatever. Is it confidential or? It's not, anyway. In general, the GBCs are not in favor of Varna as such, emphasizing that aspect. Ashram, okay, to some extent. And rural communities, to that extent. We can try to do something in the Varnashramic way. That's as far as it's got so far in our discussions. So that's the general direction we're going in as far as GBC is concerned.
Because in a way it's almost a slight dichotomy there, because for devotees, you may have rabbinical qualifications, but you're very happy to pick up the rubbish on the path or clean the temple room. It's like we do the needful.
Yeah. But so that's why the Varna we're not emphasizing. No one's too interested in implementing Varna. But of course, the Varna is your profession for making your living, basically. Not what you're doing in devotional service as far as sweeping the floor or cleaning the pots or cooking or worshiping the deity. But as far as your job for supporting your family, basically, that's what the Varna is. And in the modern world, most of them are Sudra occupations anyway, because everybody's working for somebody else. So that's basically a Sudra occupation. So 90%, 95% of the people are that. Very few independent businessmen, I think. That's the Vaishya, and then Kshatriya even fewer, and Brahmana is 0. So most of it is Sudra population supporting themselves with Sudra work. Even the Brahmanas nowadays do that. So, yeah.
And could you very briefly explain, you're talking about Jnana and etc. and Bhakti. Could you talk a little bit about Jnana Mukha Sukriti, Karma Mukha Sukriti, and Bhakti Mukha Sukriti? How you would differentiate?
Sukriti meaning?
Well, not exactly punya, but activities that you perform. Apparently, I haven't read it myself, but in Harinam Chintamani, Chandrasekhar Maharaj was talking a little bit about that the other day, that he didn't have time to elaborate.
About what produces bhakti, or the results of it?
Yes, so for example, with Jnana Mukha Sukriti, what benefit will that get? What brings bhakti?
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So we have material sukritis, things which will give effect in terms of papa and punya, which is our karma. We do sinful activities and we have to get some suffering in the future, or a bad birth, or sickness, or short life, or whatever. And we got punyas, pious activities, which are recommended in Scripture, basically non-violent activities which help other living entities. And as a result of that, you get some privilege. You get a good birth, long life, health, whatever, education, all these sort of things. That's your sukriti, material thing. Bhakti is not caused by that. Sukriti can only elevate yourself in the material world until you get to sattva gun. If you want liberation, you have to give up papa and punya, both. If you want liberation. So sukriti only elevates you up to sattva in the material world. So how is bhakti produced? It cannot be produced by sinful activity, obviously, because you just suffer. It cannot be produced by punya, because that can only elevate you to sattva gun. Bhakti itself is nirguna. So how can we get the bhakti? So the answer to that is bhakti itself. That type of sukriti, previous bhakti. But if we are not devotional at all, how can we do bhakti? So then the only way we can come to the position of even having faith in bhakti is accidental bhakti. Somebody is merciful to us, and we don't even know it, probably. Give us prasadam, we hear the holy name, we see Jagannath and Rath Yatra. That's the agata sukriti, bhakti sukriti, the accidental, because we're not looking for it. And if that accrues enough over many lifetimes, then the jiva starts getting a little favorable to the Lord, and that surfaces in his consciousness, and he becomes interested in the Lord, and he will accept the existence of the Lord, and he'll accept the conclusions of Bhagavad Gita. So that's when faith arises. So that arises from accidental bhakti. So that accidental bhakti arises because of devotees. So it's the mercy of devotees that causes the faith. Once we get the faith, then again we have to go to a devotee to get the Bhagavad Gita or the information and the guidance. So then bhakti produces bhakti.
So it has nothing to do with
good karmas, no.
Karma or
Yeah. Well, we can say the varnashram system itself, we can say, can indirectly help. It helps to some extent, because within that system itself there is a little bhakti. In other words, the worship of Vishnu is also in the varnashram system. So if you follow the varnashram system, you also have to recognize Supreme Lord to a little bit, though your interest may be material. So in that sense, you get a little bit of effect that way from that. Because mixed within the karma and all that is a little bit of devotion also. But it's a little more indirect there. The other, of course, is that sattva is better than tama or rajagun, because you control your senses and you accept scripture. So in that sense, it's favorable for bhakti. But you may become a jnani also, or a yogi as a result of that. You may not become a devotee. So the deciding factor there to become a devotee would be mercy of devotees.
About the rules that we all follow, I got asked from both the other day about why the things that fall on the floor to our heads, and I didn't really exactly know what to say.
What's that?
Why we put things on our forehead when they fall on the floor.
Oh, while we go on the floor, when we offer obeisances.
No, when things fall on the floor.
Oh, we put to our head. Oh, okay.
She asked me what,
Probably because maybe you've, if you're involved in that, then you've offended the item because you contaminated it and put it on the floor, so therefore you want to get the blessings of that article, whatever like that. Forgiveness or something from the article, I suppose that would be the idea. Offense to the item or something like that. Okay, Hare Krishna.
Brush against the devotee or accidentally touch them before you touch them and then you touch them.
So I was Bhanu Swami